Hi guys, and welcome back to Lanwan Builds. As you may know, I was building an English city based on Winchester in Hampshire, and it had a lot of flaws, especially in the planning. In this video, I'm going to be talking from my experiences with my own city and flaws that I've noticed in other cities as well, so you can build a beautiful and functional city. A quick heads up, I'm mainly going to be talking about cities in the early 1900s, but the principles apply for any English city from any time period. Number 1. An unrealistic layout. This was a key flaw with Kingsworthy, along with it not really having any planning. A lot of the streets changed at weird angles and they were far too narrow, even for medieval streets. Not just the streets, but the squares as well. For this, I'll head over to my application town that I used for the server, whose layout is far worse than Kingsworthy's. I see a lot of squares and marketplaces like these, where it's a weird shape and has no real purpose or thought behind it, and in a real city it would be a logistical nightmare. Try and make your squares and open spaces either be square or rectangular, or have some kind of way that someone could easily move around it in a vehicle, such as this one in Salisbury, where vehicles can easily move around it and to the adjoining streets. It also serves a proper, distinct purpose of housing the market. Another thing is to try and make each road have a purpose, so they don't just go on forever and have no proper reason to be in the city. Otherwise, what's the point of having them there? Even if it's just a suburban or terraced street of houses, it still has a proper purpose. And on that note, you don't have to make every house on a terraced street the same. Keep it a bit eclectic. Take a look at Fairfield Road from Winchester here. It's terraced the whole way along, but not all the terraces look the same, and this subtle change every 4 or 6 or 8 houses makes the street a lot more interesting. Number 2. Using a rigid grid. What do I mean by using a rigid grid? Well, here's probably the most famous one in the world, the Manhattan Grid Plan. It's extremely functional, don't get me wrong, but you rarely see this in British cities, as their centres are a lot older and have grown up over time, and more often than not without having any planning, as new houses are just built along them and new streets are just made at lots of different angles. Grid systems are good for Victorian and Edwardian suburbs though, and were very common for these, but even then they weren't rigid, and the adjoining streets would be at slightly different angles, but they'd still be straight, such as these examples from Southampton, Eastleigh, and Stockwell Ward, London. By having subtle angles to terraced streets, it makes the layout feel more free-flowing and natural, and will break up any industrial or suburban area. But not every angle needs to be a huge one. It could just be a very subtle one, which will work perfectly if it doesn't look out of place with nearby streets. Number 3. Incorrect districts. If you want to have a realistic city, you need to have the right districts in the right places. It's usually a good rule to make the high street and the surrounding commercial areas the centre of the city and have the cathedral close next to them, like these British cities of Salisbury, Winchester, Gloucester, and Norwich. Then, as you move out of the centre, have the older housing areas surrounding these, which should be filled with Georgian and a few medieval buildings with narrow, sometimes winding streets. On the outskirts, you would find late Victorian and Edwardian terraces in grid patterns, as I spoke about in the last tip. And if there's an industrial area, there would also be a lot of these surrounding it as well. The industrial area will usually be a port if the city's by the sea or a large river, or on the outskirts if it isn't built around either of these. Another good thing to note is that these areas will usually have a dedicated railway branch for the transport of goods, as good transport links for your city's industry is also good. Otherwise, how are they going to be able to trade with anybody? Number 4. Oldest in the centre. Coming off having correct district planning, another important thing to keep in mind is the types of buildings to have in each area. Usually the oldest parts of a city will be the central parts, as they were the first parts to be developed, and because of this they'll have the oldest buildings there. A lot of Georgian buildings and a few timber frame Tudor shops would have been the most common here, along with a couple larger, more important buildings like a town hall, a guild hall, a museum or a university. That's mainly for the commercial district, but there will be some houses near the centre of the city, mainly in the cathedral close or in the close vicinity of it, as in 100 metres or so. The close would usually be made up of late medieval or Elizabethan houses and some early Georgian ones, and the areas around it would be mainly made up of Georgian houses and a couple of Elizabethan ones. As a general rule for planning where to build houses, the further out from the city centre you go, the newer the houses are, but occasionally some old houses in the centre are knocked down as they might be falling into disrepair, and are then replaced by newer Victorian ones, but the majority of the houses in the centre will still be very old. Number 5. Working with the landscape. No city is completely flat. Even Dutch ones, and especially not British ones, so you've got to work with an uneven landscape. Landscaping can be such a useful tool if used correctly. It can be used to create false perspectives such as narrow winding streets up hills, and viewpoints giving stunning views over your city. A city would always be built up around a major land formation, like a river, by the sea, or on top of a hill, and make sure to put it in a location that would make sense for its industry and trade. If your city has a castle or an old medieval town wall, this would usually either go on the highest spot, or by the sea, or near the mouth of a river, depending on which one of these it was built around. This would have been the centre of the city during medieval times, and is going to be the oldest part, so the rest of the city would have grown up from here. Landscaping was one of my major mess-ups with Kingsworthy, as Winchester is very hilly and this creates an amazing dynamic, but Kingsworthy was just too flat, which led to it being a bit plain and boring, so make sure not to make the same mistakes as I did. You can use landscaping to your advantage. Remember, you can always change the existing landscape, and usually it's better to do it as you can design it to your liking. I hope you found those 5 tips for planning a town useful. There'll be more out about planning an early 1900s city at some point, but I wanted to share what I'd learnt when I built mine, and how it failed to hit the mark for a successful city, with the major flaw being planning. I hope you learnt a bit more on how to plan an English city, and if you did, then please like the video and sub if you want to see more. We've just hit 1k subs, which is amazing, and I never thought I'd make it this far. Which I guess that means I have to rebuild my cathedral, which I can't lie, I'm kind of looking forward to. Sorry this video took so long to come out. It was another case of a video taking longer than I thought it would, and a lot of work behind the scenes on other projects happening that should have videos coming out on them very soon. And with all that being said, I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.